My Patreon members' terminal subclade is I-FT405495. It is truly his terminal subclade because he has no private variants left. He shares this branch with his first cousin twice removed. He is an American that can trace his earliest known patrilineal ancestor to the town of Rowley in the Massachusetts Bay Colony circa 1640. The only evidence we know for sure is that he was born in England and he shows up in Rowley, Massachusetts Bay Colony circa 1640 with his brother. These facts were confirmed with Y chromosome DNA testing. The two brothers both belong to the I-FT25844 branch, which dates approximately to 1583 CE, according to family tree DNA age estimates. This subclade has two child branches representing the two brothers' patrilineal lines in the New World. Due to founder effects in the New World, my Patreon member has a lot of subclade and STR matches in the USA that connect to those two brothers. Let us now jump back in time to the Bronze Age and Iron Age to see what was going on with my Patreon members' patrilineal line back then. He belongs to IZ63's downstream Bronze Age branch IPR683, which, albeit dating to the Bronze Age, has a lot of downstream branches that have a strong correlation with East Germanic tribes. This correlation with East Germanic tribes can be found in my Patreon members' subclades all the way through to the start of the current era. Recently, a new preprint was released titled Steppe Ancestry in Western Eurasia and the Spread of the Germanic Languages. In this preprint, there was a lot of interesting and useful information regarding ancient Germanic tribal migrations. Additionally, in the supplemental information, there was a lot of useful data regarding genetic clustering for ancient DNA samples from past studies. To quote the preprint, quote, "In contrast to these Western and Northern Germanic-speaking populations, we find the Wheelbark population from Poland to be primarily of Eastern Scandinavian ancestry, supporting a Swedish origin for East Germanic groups," end quote. Let us now take a look at the evidence for this East Germanic correlation, starting with subclade IL1242, which dates to the Bronze Age. In terms of earliest known patrilineal countries of origin, as of May 14th, 2024 in the Family Tree DNA database, there are two people that claim Sweden, showing this Swedish origin for East Germanic tribes. There are four people that claim Poland, showing this connection to the Wheelbark culture, these tribes entering Poland from Sweden. And then we see modern distributions in countries that East Germanic tribes, especially the Goths, were known to have traveled and settled in, such as Spain, the Russian Federation, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. At the start of the pre-Roman Iron Age, around 757 BCE, with the IY104500 subclade, he branches apart from a modern tester that claims Turkey for their earliest known patrilineal country of origin. As you can see in the following map, the Goths had a genetic influence in modern-day Turkey. At the start of the current era, around 64 CE, his patrilineal line shares the subclade I-FT18861 with an individual that claims Bulgaria for their earliest known patrilineal country of origin. The Goths had a genetic influence in Bulgaria, as you can see from the following map of their migrations, in addition to many other areas in continental Europe, such as Hungary, where my Patreon member has his closest ancient DNA connections with this same subclade. These two ancient DNA connections were mentioned in the 2022 study, The Genetic Origin of Huns, Avars, and Conquering Hungarians. In the family tree DNA database, the first ancient connection is labeled I-FT405495. He lived sometime between 800 and 830 CE. He was discovered in Majoris Hallam, Tiszafüred, Hungary. Mr. Tiszafüred509 was assigned to the East Scandinavian genetic cluster, which can be associated with Sweden. It is quite surprising that his ancestors were able to keep this Sweden origin autosomal DNA despite traveling through continental Europe for multiple centuries, most likely with the Goths. In the following map from the preprint, you can see that East Scandinavian light green ancient DNA samples are quite rare in that area of Hungary during that time period. The other ancient DNA connection, Tiszafüred798, is also from the same location in Hungary and also shares the same current era subclade with my Patreon member. Interesting to note, though, that these two ancient DNA samples, albeit sharing 3 additional SNPs with each other, were not recently related. Their patrilineal lines most likely diverged apart from each other a few centuries before they lived in Hungary. His ancestors did mix with Slavic peoples, and he was assigned to the Baltic genetic cluster. To quote the recently released preprint in regards to this Baltic cluster, quote, "This cline includes populations related to the spread of Slavic populations in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and are to be related to the Baltic Bronze Age ancestry originating in Northeast Europe," end quote. The Baltic cluster, which is represented by the pink ancient DNA samples, was quite influential in that region of Hungary during that time period. Unfortunately, there is a large time gap of over 1,000 years of missing subclade data between his branch that dates to approximately 64 CE that he shares with East Germanic tribes and his branch that dates to around 1179 CE that he shares with an individual that has ancestry from England. So any theory regarding how and when his patrilineal forefathers entered England is going to be a bit speculative. That being said, though, I feel that I can rule out the Anglo-Saxons during the early Middle Ages for 2 reasons. First, originating in the Jutland Peninsula and northern Germany during the Iron Age, they would have been carrying South Scandinavian cluster DNA and not the East Scandinavian cluster DNA associated with my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers leading up to the current era. Second, due to founder effects in England during the early Middle Ages, I would expect to see a lot more branching along his patrilineal line during this time period if his forefathers were indeed Anglo-Saxons. I'm going to propose a few speculative theories for how my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers might have entered England, starting with the least speculative and ending with the most speculative. For me, the most logical scenario is his East Scandinavian patrilineal forefathers would have entered England during the Viking Age from either southern Sweden or northern Poland. During the first millennium CE, did the famous Geats from Beowulf living in Sweden have some earlier genetic affiliation with the peoples that would enter Poland and be known as the Wilbark culture and later the Goths? And if so, were my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers Geats leading up to the Viking Age? Could they have been absorbed into Danish or Norse westward Viking Age migrations to England? Or perhaps during the first millennium CE, his patrilineal forefathers were the descendants of the Wilbark culture, living in Pomerania, in northern Poland, near the coast of the Baltic Sea. Perhaps he had some Viking Age affiliation with the famous Yams Vikings who set up base in that region, and maybe he made his way westward to England with them. Regardless of either scenario, it is during the Viking Age that this East Scandinavian cluster DNA is entering England, and not earlier during the early Middle Ages with the Anglo-Saxons. To quote the recently released preprint, quote, by the Viking Age, we detect Eastern Scandinavian and Western Scandinavian ancestries across Britain and its islands, representing Viking migrations from Sweden and Norway, end quote. I mentioned earlier in the video that we don't know for sure where my Patreon member's patrilineal forefather came from prior to the Massachusetts Bay Colony circa 1640 CE. But there is circumstantial evidence that alludes to him possibly being born in northeastern England in Yorkshire. His one match that connects to his patrilineal line around 1179 CE is an American whose ancestor came from the region of Cheshire in northwestern England prior to arriving in the New World. So perhaps their patrilineal lines have some association with the Viking kingdom of Jorvik in northern England. Now this American match that connects to his patrilineal line around the year 1179 CE has a famous surname and quite a famous paper trail going more than 30 generations back in time to Geoffrey V, Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Angevin that gave birth to Henry II. Now, usually I'm a bit skeptical of paper trails that connect to famous individuals and are 30 plus generations, simply because it increases the chance of a non-paternal event somewhere along those 30 plus generations. I have to admit, though, that I do find it quite fascinating and interesting that their patrilineal lines diverged apart around 1179 CE, just around the time when the Angevins entered England. And if you follow the paper trail even farther back in time than Geoffrey V, you see that this patrilineal line has roots in southern Normandy, France. Vikings not only settled in Normandy, France, but they also raided and traded along major rivers such as the Loire River. So there were ample opportunities during the Viking Age for my Patreon members' East Scandinavian patrilineal line to enter the region of northern France. That map comes from the 2020 study, Population Genomics of the Viking World. My last theory, which is the most speculative with the least amount of evidence, but ties my Patreon members' patrilineal line back to the East Germanic tribes, the Goths. Perhaps his patrilineal forefather entered France with the Visigoths, and then later entered England with Angevin movements, since the area of Aquitaine was acquired through the marriage of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. With an influx of individuals from these regions of France entering England during this time period, perhaps there was some type of NPE along that paper trail of 30 plus generations. Perhaps the lack of testers from France in the database, because DNA testing is illegal in France, accounts for the lack of subclade matches for my Patreon member leading up to his subclade that dates to approximately 1179 CE. What additional information can be learned from his STR matches? Well, he has several promising leads at the Y111 level that have different surnames than him, that most likely branched apart from his patrilineal line sometime within the past 1,000 years. He should get these individuals upgraded to big Y700 so we can know exactly where they land on the haplotree. Unfortunately, I don't see any promising leads to break up that large time gap of missing information from the start of the current era to his post-Viking Age branch that dates to approximately 1179 CE. So he'll have to wait for new testers to gain more information regarding how his patrilineal forefathers might have entered England. Unfortunately, I also noticed some convergence at Y67 and Y37. One individual was actually positive for IZ58 and not even IZ63. So he should be a bit cautious when pursuing those leads. Thanks for watching.